Welcome to video 8 in our series on the story of Abraham. And in this video, we're going to be looking at Abraham's encounter with three visitors which turned out to be heavenly. When we last saw Abraham, God had promised him a son through Sarah and given him the covenant of circumcision as a sign of the covenant between them. In Genesis 18, God appears again to Abraham. And we read there that the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, three men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. So we're told here that the Lord, or Yahweh, appears again to Abram near the trees of Mamre, while Abram is sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. The words heat of the day remind us of God arriving to look for Adam and Eve in the cool of the day in Genesis 3:8. So this is a hint that this is a divine visitor. And Abram rushes to show hospitality to these three visitors, which in Genesis 19 is similar to how Lot responds to two of the visitors when they arrive in Sodom. Now, when we're told that the Lord, or Yahweh, appeared to him in verse 1, this is from the perspective of the narrator. Abraham doesn't know at first the identity of his visitors, and his hospitality is not prompted by their identity, but by his hospitality to strangers. What we know about the identity of these visitors, Abram only comes to discover during the course of the conversation that he has with them. Verse 1 tells us that Yahweh appeared to Abraham, but when Abram looks up in verse 2, what he sees are three men standing nearby. This is what Abraham sees. So we have the perspective from outside of the narrator that he's encountering the Lord, but what he sees with his eyes is three human beings. He sees these three men standing nearby, and he rushes over to offer them hospitality. And he addresses not all three men, but one of them in particular, but he offered to wash all their feet. And perhaps I think it was apparent that one of the three visitors had a higher status amongst the three. Well, the question is, who are the three visitors? And I believe the three visitors are Yahweh, perhaps manifested as the angel of the Lord, and two other angels. And we know this from the fact that in Genesis 18:22, later in the story, we're told that the men turned away and went toward Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord, or Yahweh. And that Yahweh and Abram have a conversation, and then in Genesis 19:1, we're told that the two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, where they go to meet with Lot. Now, in the Bible, it's important to understand that angels are always male, and they appear to humans in human form. If they were to appear with wings, I think people would have heart attacks. And so, because angels appear as human beings, this is why Hebrews 13:2 exhorts its audience to show hospitality to strangers, because some have by doing so entertained strangers unaware. That verse reads, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. This is a clear allusion to Abram's entertaining of the three visitors in Genesis 18, and perhaps also to Lot's entertaining of two of these visitors in Genesis 19, in which the identity of these visitors is not clear at first. They seem to be humans, and then later on it's apparent that they are heavenly visitors. Now, Abram is showing hospitality not because he thinks these are heavenly visitors, but he's showing the hospitality expected of a gracious host within his cultural context without knowing at first that they are from heaven. And he doesn't know their identity because they appear to him in human form, as do angels in the Bible. So we read next that Abraham says, "Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you've come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." So Abraham sees these three men, they're on a journey somewhere, and he offers to refresh them before they continue on their journey. And his hospitality would have been expected of a host who was responsible for taking care of his guests' needs and safety whilst they were under his roof. Hence Lot's actions in Genesis 19 in trying to protect the two angels. Abram's visitors play along and receive the food and hospitality offered to them by saying, "Do as you have said." And Abram went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour. Knead it and make cakes." And Abram ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So Abram is hurrying and attentively showing hospitality, and Sarah is in the background. And I want you to hold in your mind this instance of Abram's hospitality with what we're going to see later on with Rebekah. But Abram under-promises. He under-promises a morsel of bread and overperforms with this grand feast. His visitors play along. They receive the food and hospitality that's offered them, and they actually eat the food that is placed before them. And by doing so, Yahweh is making a concession to the ignorance of Abram as to who is really before him. Theologians speak of the condescension of God to reveal himself to us in a way that we can understand him. And I think this is what Yahweh is doing with Abraham. He's meeting him where his perception as to who Yahweh is allows, until he can more clearly see and understand who he is as he's revealed to him during their interactions. Well, they say to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She's in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advancing years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So they asked Abram, "Where is Sarah, his wife?" Now we don't know if he had told them his wife's name, but if he had not done so, this may have been the first clue that these visitors were heavenly. You imagine someone knowing something about you that you've not told them. And then in verse 10, after that clue that these men know more than they ought to, we're told explicitly that the Lord Yahweh said. I think what's happening is the reality of what's going on is breaking now into Abram's consciousness. Yahweh is identified as one of the visitors, and he says to Abraham that he'll return next year and Sarah will have a son. By this point, it would have become clear to Abraham, oh, these visitors are heavenly, and that Yahweh is one of them, because only Yahweh can promise to give a son as he has promised to him before, and it put the timeline of a year on it, as he did in Genesis 17. Now, Sarah is in the tent behind Yahweh hearing all of this. And I think God is here because he wants to communicate the message to Sarah. He's already made this promise to Abraham in Genesis 17. But perhaps he can't speak directly with Sarah because the men meet and she stays in the tent because she's not a man. And so while she's in the tent, she's overhearing the conversation, and by this indirect means, he's speaking to her. And the narrator reminds us that Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in years. They were 99 and about 89 respectively. And then we're not reminded, but now we're told, this is a new development, that the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. And that means that her menstrual periods have ceased. She's now menopausal. She's past the age of childbearing. So if being barren all these past years was not a almost insurmountable enough obstacle for God to bring a child through her For Abraham, now given her age, having a child is a biological impossibility. And often as I read this passage, I ask myself, did God really have to wait this long to fulfill his promise to Abraham to give him a child? And I think the point is that God wanted to be clear that this child of the promise was entirely by God's grace or gift and not at all by human effort. God wanted Abram and Sarah at the point where they were completely dependent on him to fulfill his promise and not reliant on their human plans and stratagems as they demonstrated they would resort to by their earlier efforts in Egypt and with Hagar. God had to take them beyond themselves all the way here for them to be completely dependent on him and get past their self-reliance. Well, having given us these facts, the narrator has set us up well, so that we're not surprised to hear that Sarah laughs to herself when she hears this ridiculous news that she's to become pregnant as a menopausal woman at 89 years old. We, by now, knowing all these facts, do not find Sarah's laughter to be unreasonable. We would probably laugh ourselves. And so Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son.'" Now, Sarah laughs to herself like Abraham laughed to himself in Genesis 17 when God told him that now approaching 190 respectively, he and Sarah would have a son through their aged bodies. And so Sarah laughs to herself, I think because she thinks she is past the age of childbearing. And both her and Abram are too old to have children. And as she puts it in her own words, she's worn out. But I think she's also laughing because she has been hurt and disappointed by the unfulfilled dream for which she has been longing in the past. She comes across here a little cynical, as if she doesn't want to allow herself to hope for this anymore, because she doesn't want to deal with the pain of hoping and longing anymore. And she's hurt that God didn't give this to her when she was younger. You can hear the cynicism or sarcasm in her statement. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" And pleasure here refers to the physical sexual activity that would be necessary to become pregnant, as well as to the pleasure of having a child. But the word translated as pleasure in our English translations is the Hebrew word Eden, recalling the Garden of Eden and pointing back to the place of blessing and abundance lost at the fall. Sarah is saying, "Shall I have this blessing of being fruitful and multiplying that was promised and longed for and painfully unfulfilled, leaving nothing but empty disappointment?" But Yahweh challenges Sarah on her lack of faith, asking if anything is too hard for God. And we know that it is Yahweh because he promises a son. Only God can do that. And his words in this promise are validated since not only does he know her name, but he overhears her even though she's behind him laughing to herself and speaking to herself. And so Sarah denies it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. But Yahweh says, "No, but you did laugh." Sarah is afraid like Abraham, and so she lies like him when he has lied in the past. And she's being a seed of the snake. She had laughed to herself and not out loud, and so it was a half-truth to say, "I did not laugh." But Yahweh calls her on her lie. She doesn't respond, or she doesn't get a chance to respond. And I think what the biblical writer, by saying she's afraid, is highlighting again is this tension between fear and faith. When Abraham goes down the wrong path and Sarah in the past, they've given in to fear instead of holding on to faith. And this is the place that she is at, and so God calls her on it, but he moves on. And we read next in this slide that the men set out from there and they looked down towards Sodom. And Abram went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." Well, having received Abram's hospitality and conveyed to him and Sarah the message intended, Abram's visitors set out and looked down toward Sodom. And Abram, being the good host that he is, walks them out. Yahweh speaks to himself as he's being walked out in self-deliberation, and or he's speaking to his angels as in divine counsel, and he allows Abraham to hear. He asks whether he should hide from Abraham what he's going to do about Sodom, or should he bring Abraham into his council deliberation, seeing Abraham enjoy a privileged position as God's covenant partner, through which God will build a great and mighty nation and bless all the nations of the earth. God essentially is asking whether he can trust Abraham. Well, Yahweh goes on to say that Abram will become a great nation through which the world will be blessed, because he's been chosen by Yahweh to instruct his family in Yahweh's ways by doing righteousness and justice, so that Yahweh may fulfill his promises to him. Verse 19 reads, "For I've chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." God is asking whether Abram can be included in his inner circle. In Amos 3:7, we're told that God does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. That verse reads, "Surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets." God's question, whether he should hide from Abram what he plans to do, indicates that God intends for Abram to serve as a prophet in his covenant partner role to be a blessing to all the nations. In Genesis 27, God tells Abimelech that Abram is a prophet, and he will pray for him if he returns his wife. Abimelech returns Sarah, and Abram does in fact pray to God for Abimelech, and God hears his prayer. You see, prophets not only speak God's word to people, but also intercede with God on behalf of people. Example, Moses begging God not to destroy the Israelites after they sinned in the incident with the golden calf. And so because of their intermediary role, God brings prophets in on his plans and his will. And God intends for Abram to play an intermediary role by being the means through which God will bless all nations, and so he enters into covenant with Abraham. The question is whether he can trust Abraham to play this role. Does Abram care enough to intercede on behalf of others for their blessing? Or is he all about himself as he was in Egypt and with Hagar, in bringing curses and not blessings on others? What Genesis 18 demonstrates is that Abraham is growing in his relationship with God and in his covenant role as he acts like a prophet by interceding on behalf of Sodom for their blessing. And so we read in verse 20, "Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." And so the outcry, similar to Abel's blood and the flood and the Tower of Babel and the Israelites in Egypt, refers to God hearing about injustice and coming down to deal with it. But God, notice, is a just God. And so he's got to go down and investigate before bringing judgment. God knows all things, but there's a point here in the narrative that God is being careful to establish that things are as bad as he knows they are before he brings about judgment. And so the men turned from there in verse 22 and went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord. So the men are two of the angels and they leave, but we're told that Abraham is standing before one of the visitors who is Yahweh. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it?" And so we see here Abraham growing in his relationship with God and in his role as a covenant partner. We see that he has concern for others than himself. And we see him interceding with God on behalf of others for their blessing as opposed to them being cursed. And we see him growing in his confidence in his relationship with God. They've been journeying together for some time, that he can say what he feels even though he's a little tentative about doing it. And he says, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so the righteous fear as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." So Abraham says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" He's asking if he can trust God. And he presumes to speak to Yahweh about justice. And he negotiates with Yahweh. But notice if you read the text, Yahweh is not negotiating. He simply concedes whatever number Abraham suggests. If you ever negotiated the price of something, you know the way it works is you say, "I want to buy this for $10. And the seller says, no, $100. And you say, no, I'm not paying more than 15. And they say, no, I may give it to you for 90. And you keep going till you meet in the middle. But in this interaction between Yahweh and Abraham, Yahweh is not moving the numbers. He is conceding whatever number Abraham suggests. And I think this suggests that he is generous and that he has a rich store of patience, grace, and compassion. I think the idea is that if he were even to find one righteous in the city, then he would not destroy it. And Abraham and him go all the way down to 10, but Yahweh does not say 10 and no more. Abraham, we read, then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once, suppose 10 are found there." And Yahweh answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." And the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So Yahweh stops where Abraham does. In point of fact, not even 10 righteous people would be found in Sodom. The only persons that were saved were Noah and his 2 daughters, and his wife ended up as a pillar of salt. But they were to be saved not because of their own righteousness, but because of Abraham. Really, there was only one righteous in Sodom, according to Peter, and that is Lot. And even him was not that righteous, but he was righteous compared to the wicked in Sodom. So we read at the conclusion of the destruction of Sodom that Abram went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. So only Lot is saved. And he's saved because God remembered Abraham like he remembered Noah during the flood and didn't destroy everything. Abraham has now reached the place where his intercession and blamelessness before God results in the salvation of others. He's making progress. And we will see where his journey with God leads him on the next occasion.